So today we are talking about team effectiveness. And this is, I think, a pretty relevant chapter for this class in particular because you're all working on teams, and as you've likely found, they can be pretty tough. I remember my days in undergrad in my MBA program, my teamwork was one of the most difficult things. So what do you think about what's hard about teams? Why does it happen? Why does that tend to be the least enjoyable aspect of work for most students? So you might have some social loafing going on where some people kind of sit back and let you do all the work. That certainly happens. It happens every semester in 110, and we hear that a lot. And I think for a lot of you, and me included, we like to be responsible for our own work. We don't like to rely on the work of other people, and we like to be rewarded and incentivized for our own work. So that's what makes teamwork particularly difficult, and that's one of the reasons why we have you do it in this class, because as most of you who are working now, you probably know that teamwork is it's a part of life, that you're going to be involved in working on teams whether you like it or not. So it's really important to deal with that conflict and to get the experience with that now. And we'll talk more about negotiation and conflict in a later chapter. But today, what I want to talk about is, what is a team? What makes an effective team? And sort of what are some ways in which you can be more effective today in the teams that you're working on? So in terms of, what is a team? We'll start out by just sort of defining, a basic team. So a team is a group of people who are collectively accountable for definable outcomes and have a high degree of interdependence and interaction. So is a team always necessary? Do you think, what are some cases where you might not want to work in a team? If one person can deal with an issue, then you really don't want to displace responsibility for that among other people, because it just becomes problematic and you're dealing with a lot of issues that naturally come with teams, like conflict, that you wouldn't have to deal with otherwise. So teamwork is something we want to rely on when interdependence is necessary, when people have different skill sets and they need to come together to solve a problem. So when interaction among individuals is necessary. And in that case, what we want to think about is, how are we going to incentivize people to do a job? If you're incentivizing people individually for teamwork, then that's not going to lead to the best possible outcome generally. Usually when we're talking about compensation and incentives, we want to think about how can we incentivize them to work as a team rather than just compete individually. So if an individual expert doesn't exist that can solve the problem, if you need more innovation or creativity, we know that teamwork, because of the different perspectives on teams tend to be more innovative, they tend to be more creative. When you want to create a context where people feel connected. So if you are in an organization, you want a more cohesive culture, it can be better to rely on teams. And again, when interdependence is required, and this is generally when we're talking about, you need complementary skill sets. So complementary and supplementary skill sets often get confused. Complementary just means that you have different skill sets that you bring to the table, whereas supplementary would be more of the same skill set. So an accounting team, you might have a number of cost accountants, so they have supplementary skills. Although let's say you've got a team that involves your C-suite, so your CFO, your CEO, your chief operating officer, your chief technology officer, chief resource officer, this team has complementary skill sets. They bring something different to the table. So when they approach a problem, they approach it from different perspectives, and you're able to find more creative solutions to that problem. So if we kind of break this down to the bare minimum, how do we classify teams? You can think about it as teams that recommend things, teams that make or do things, and teams that run things. So you've all been on at least one of these teams. And right now you're all working on a team that recommends things. So in your Management 110 case, my guess is that you're going to have to work as a team to try to recommend a solution to a problem. So let's kind of walk through what that means and what each one of these are. So teams that recommend things, these are generally referred to as task forces or project groups, but usually you hear the term task force. So an example of this, at Fresno State, we know that our students and our staff and faculty work really hard, but job satisfaction isn't always the highest relative to other institutions. And things like pay isn't, you're not going to be paid as much working at Fresno State as you would say one of the universities that I spent some time at was a private university in Georgia with $1 billion endowment. They have enough money to pay way above minimum wage, but Fresno State's a public institution without as many resources. So that and along with some other things has led to decreases in job satisfaction. So recently I spent a semester working on a task force. This was with people from all different areas of the university, including students, to figure out how can we address, what's driving lower job satisfaction and how can we address that? And we are coming out with these different, one of the big ways to improve job satisfaction, we know, is to increase the acknowledgement and appreciation of employees. So things like the High Five program that Fresno State recently put out is something that we did based on research from companies like JetBlue, where you just, somebody does a good job, you've got a space where you can publicly acknowledge that. So that's a type of thing a task force does. Generally, it's people with complementary skills who are trying to recommend a solution to a problem. But that sometimes in organizations, that's kind of where those task forces stop. So once the recommendation is made, and this could be the same thing with like a consulting group. So if Boston Consulting Group or McKinsey comes in to solve a problem, they're not actually going to stay to solve that problem for you. They're just going to see what the problem is and recommend a solution for you to implement. So at that point, the team that make or does things generally takes over. And so you can think about these as typically these are customer-facing roles. So, well, I should say customer-facing roles in terms of sales and service, and then on the back end we have operations. So teams that make or do things, they're generally the ones who are handling day-to-day activities. So if you have an issue related to sales, then you might have a sales team who gets together and tries to resolve to implement whatever solution that team that recommends or the team that recommends things, ultimately recommends. And so when you're thinking, okay, what's an example of a team that makes or does things? We might say you've got like a quality assurance team in a manufacturing plant. So this would be a team that does things. So they look at quality issues in a product or service and they say, okay, how can we resolve this problem? What do we need to implement to solve this? And then they go ahead and do that thing. So in terms of teams that run things tend to be managing a significant functional activity. So I mentioned the C-suite earlier. This refers to the head of every functional area in your organization. So at the top is your chief operating officer or your chief executive officer. And then reporting to that person is generally your chief operating officer, your chief financial officer, your chief human resource officer, and your chief technology officer. At a minimum, you've got those positions. So this is an example. These individuals working together as a team that runs things. They oversee the business, and they generally don't manage day-to-day activities. They look toward accomplishing long-term strategic objectives of the organization. So teams that recommend things tend to be things like task forces. Teams that make or do things, these tend to be in areas like operations, sales, service. Oftentimes they're customer facing, or at least they're working on products that customers are using or buying. And then teams that run things tend to be more in leadership roles that are looking at long-term strategic issues. So we know generally what teams are. So teams are essentially a bunch of individuals working together with complementary skill sets where interdependence is required. But that doesn't really mean that they're high functioning. When we look at what makes a high functioning team, these are individuals who not only have complementary skills, they not only work together to innovate, but they produce consistently superior results. Now, this can be really hard to do.
when we're trying to put teams together that are highly effective, there are a lot of things that get in the way. There are a lot of barriers. People have their own personal differences, personal experiences, and their own skill sets that don't necessarily complement one another. So first we need to define, how do we determine if a team is high performing, and then we can investigate what makes a high performing team. So in terms of just measurables, if you want to say, is my team doing well? You're generally going to look at three things. So you're going to look at production output, member satisfaction, and continued cooperation. So production output is, what are the outcomes or the objectives I'm trying to achieve, and how well am I meeting those? How well is my team meeting those objectives? In terms of member satisfaction, it's not enough to be doing consistently well. If your members aren't satisfied, their ultimately performance is going to go down. They're going to leave the group. And so that's not going to be a consistently high performing team. That's going to be a high performing team for a short while. So members should be satisfied. And then 3, continued cooperation. So these members should want to work together again in the future. So what do you think? Only one of these is really about output. So what kind of sticks out to you about member satisfaction and continued cooperation? Like in terms of teams being high performing, you need to be able to establish and maintain good relationships. I'd say that's one of the most fundamental aspects of a team. When we see teams that break down, and especially in this class, the ones that do the worst, they tend to have the most unresolved conflict. So at the end of the semester, when they walk in to do their presentations, they, either teams are talking with each other, they're happy and smiling, or they're kind of standing as far apart from each other as they can because they're really pissed off at each other. And generally those teams that are smiling and talking to each other, they tend to do better because they've established better relationships and they've had better working norms throughout the project. So in terms of member satisfaction, continued cooperation, those being 2 of the 3 fundamental aspects of a high-performing team, we know relationships matter, especially when it comes to teams. So let's kind of take a look at the research. When we look at meta-analyses, a meta-analysis is essentially all the research that's ever been done on a topic. A researcher will go in and summarize what the data are telling us, summarize those findings. So instead of, you can probably find an argument for something that says this works and another argument for something that says this doesn't work. The research, every individual paper isn't perfect. But when we look at the sum of all the research that's ever been done, we can have a lot of confidence that, okay, this is something we can believe in, that we know this to be correct. And so that's what we've done here with this meta-analysis. And we say, okay, from this meta-analysis, what makes up a high-performing team? Well, there are 5 things that stand out. And this is generalizable across essentially all teams in most parts of the world. So generalizability, we talked about big E evidence and little e evidence. This would be big E because it's not generalizable, or it's not something that can just be applied to one company or one area, but it generally holds true for most companies. And that is high performance teams tend to be small in size. They tend to have capable and complementary members. They tend to have a shared performance and performance objectives, productive norms, and mutual accountability. So I'm going to walk through what that means. So when you're determining, okay, how many people do we need on a particular team, you might say, well, based on this time of year, we have, X number of customers, and so we need this many people on the floor. That's different than, say, working in an organization when you're not dealing with, for those positions that aren't dealing with customers, or the teams that aren't dealing with customers directly. So the teams that recommend things and the teams that run things, generally they're going to be a different team size than those customer-facing teams, because you might need more or less simply, based on the situation or the context, the number of customers you have. But we found for the others, team sizes of generally 5 to 8 usually work best. Jeff Bezos said he believes in the 2 pizza group, that if 2 pizzas can't feed the group, it's too big. And so We know that this has been backed up by a lot of research, and companies like even Google usually sticks to 7 people at most on the team. So it's big enough where you can have enough diverse skill sets, but it's small enough where you can still be fairly cohesive, get to know one another. And so that generally tends to work best. So in terms of capable and complementary members, what I mean by this is going back to that complementary skill set. You have enough, when you think about your own teams right now, you probably all have different experiences. You signed up for this because you thought you were going to go to another part of the world. And so my guess is that you're similar in terms of, some of your personal characteristics. You're adventurous, you like to learn new things, and so there's going to be a lot of things that are really similar about you, but in terms of your experiences and your skill sets, there's going to be a lot of things that are really different. And so what we want to do is match up those diverse skill sets to the problems that we're facing, to make sure that, okay, if we have, let's say, an issue that spans across a number of boundaries, so maybe we've got an engineering issue, but it's in HR. And so we know that we need somebody with an expertise in HR and also engineering. And let's say it has to do with, our website. So then we probably want somebody who's an IT expert as well. So that's what I mean by these complementary skill sets. We want the right set of diverse skill sets on a team. So in terms of shared purpose and performance objectives, who here feels like they work for a company where you have a real, you find meaning in your work? You don't find meaning in the work that you're doing, if you don't think it adds value to your life in some way, you probably found it's hard to stay motivated. It's hard to do your best. And for some of you that might not be true, but for the majority of us, we really need to find passion and purpose in what it is we do to be the best at it. Otherwise, you're just kind of going through the motions, right? So when we talk about shared purpose and performance objectives at work, we can create those in a couple of different ways. One is our teams should understand what it is that they're trying to achieve. So when you see on here outcome-based goals, this is, if you're at point A, what does point Z look like? What does success on this team look like? How do we measure that? If you can't measure, it's going to be really hard to manage. So you need to figure out, what is it this team expected to do? And how are you going to get there? What are the steps you're going to take along the way to achieve that? And that takes us to activity-based goals. So when you think about activity-based goals, this is the process. So you've got process and outcome. This is, what are those things that you need to do to ultimately reach that outcome that you're looking for? And then one thing that's not mentioned here, but it's really important, is superordinate goals. So this was actually created in the research in the 40s and 50s. And what this professor had done, his last name is Sharif. He was looking into different identities that people have in their groups. And he found that within organizations, you tend to find people who are really competitive. You may have found this at your own jobs, that you go to work and people are they are maybe deceitful, or maybe trying to show that they're better than you or than other people, and just being really competitive in general. And so competitiveness within an organization can be a good thing at times, but it can also hurt the overall performance of the organization when people are hurting others' performance in order to advance their own. And so what a superordinate goal is it's a goal that everyone on the team should strive for. So everyone in the organization, really, this is like the ultimate goal. What are you trying to do in general? And so for some organizations, this might be to help the environment in some way, or it might be to make people's lives better, whatever it is. It might be to advance sustainable energy. And so this is something that at the end of the day, you're all working for the same thing, and it brings you together. Those lines that kind of demarcate us versus them, or you versus me, you don't have those as much when you have this similar thing that everybody's working toward. And that's really what's good about those superordinate goals, because it brings everyone in the organization toward that same goal. Whereas you might have teams competing based on different outcomes or different activity-based goals. Superordinate goals are superordinate, meaning that they're higher in the hierarchy, higher in importance than those other goals. So you need to find that shared purpose and performance objectives in some way for your team, something that you're all working toward. And then next is productive norms and working approach. So norms can be implicit or explicit. Implicit meaning that they're not written down, but these are expectations or rules of behavior that are understood, but they're not explicitly written anywhere. Explicit norms are simply, this is a rule governing behavior that is written down. So it could be something like, we're not late for meetings, or we don't call people after 5 p.m., something like that. So what's a societal rule that you follow that's implicit? It's not written down, but you just do it naturally. So I'm going to give you an assignment. Next time you're in an elevator, I want you to go up and just stand in front of, let's say there's one person, 20 people, doesn't matter. Just stand as close as you can to someone, facing them directly. What do you think the response would be if you walked in the elevator and did that? Imagine there's one other person in the elevator. Instead of going to a corner, you go directly in front of that person and stand in front of them and just look at them. What do you think the reaction would be? So, we have norms for, we have implicit norms, unwritten norms for a lot of different things. But I think that was, if you're a person who's been caught in that type of situation, it's super uncomfortable. And generally there's a response from people in society that ensure that norm holds true. So people give dirty looks to that person, or, they immediately move away. Whatever they do, that, what you just did wasn't acceptable. And so norms guide our day-to-day behavior, pretty regularly. I mean, if you think about it, I think most of us would like to wear sweatpants and a t-shirt and just chill out all day, right? And I guess most of us can now, right? But, if you show up to work generally in sweatpants, probably not going to have it's probably not going to go well, because we have a norm that, okay, you need to dress a certain way to be professional, right? So productive norms on a group, this is something that we're going to come back to, but there are things, obvious things like respecting one another, showing up on time, doing what you say you're going to do, being accountable. But we'll dig into that a little bit more today, because I want to talk about some of the productive norms at Google and what they've found to be worthwhile. So right now we've got teams generally small size, 5 to 8. Google is, I use them a lot for this type of research, because they're really good at collecting data and determining what works based on data. So for them, they found about 7 people on a team tends to be best. But again, that's going to differ if you're a team that makes or does things, because it might be dependent on, for example, the number of customers you have. You might need a bigger team to manage that. Shared purpose and performance objectives, and productive norms and working approach. And lastly, mutual accountability. So we must be able to trust the members on our team. And if you can't, it's going to be really hard to work together. If people tell you that they're going to do things and they don't do them, particularly for a project like the one that you're working on for your virtual course, if you're relying on someone to do something and they don't do it, then that's going to be really problematic, because your grade depends on it. And if they fail once, then, then you're probably going to lose your trust in them. And so, you might not see them too many times. You might not see them too many times in this class after that, but you're going to see them again in the future, and that's going to be tough to work with them again. So in terms of, how do we encourage mutual accountability? As a manager or leader, you can do that through different incentives. So you can give them cooperative rather than competitive rewards. So if you want people on a team to work together, for example, you might pay out their bonuses based on them meeting a team goal, rather than providing them individual incentives for achieving something. So in terms of Google, I've mentioned them a few times now. So let's go into, what makes an effective team at Google. And this would be going back to that generalizability. We talk about little e versus big E generalizability. So this would be generalizable across Google. We know that these attributes that I'm about to go over, they work at Google. But we wouldn't necessarily know if they work on a broader scale or could be applied to other organizations unless we had research to support that. And what we found is actually the attributes that make an effective team at Google tend to make an effective team most places. So you'll see that they overlap with those 5 characteristics of high performance teams that we just went over. So this is based on a 2-year study of more than 200 Googlers. And what they were curious about is, do the type of people matter as much as, you know, how people interact, structure their work, and view their contributions. And what they found is that the type of person matters much less than these 5 characteristics I'm about to go over. So, you know, when we look at things like someone's personality, their personal characteristics, that doesn't matter as much as these 5 attributes. So number 1 is psychological safety. So does anyone here feel like they can take risks at work without, you know, getting in trouble? It's going to be hard for you to be, it's going to be really hard for you to be innovative, to be creative, to be authentic if you're afraid that you're going to be punished for making a mistake. And there's a famous example, and it's sometimes told about IBM, sometimes Johnson & Johnson, where there's a person on the team who makes a huge multi-million-dollar mistake, goes into his boss's office and says, you know, I assume you're going to fire me now. And the boss says, you know, why would I fire you? I just invested $5 million into you. What do you lost? And the moral of that story is that your team members should be able to make mistakes, people on your team. And oftentimes, especially if you hold yourself to a high standard, you probably hold other people to a very high standard as well. And we need to realize that if we don't allow people to make mistakes, they're not going to feel that they can be authentic or be creative or be innovative. And that's going to lead to pretty bland group and probably not very innovative solutions. So in terms of psychological safety, one of the ways that we can do this is by having a very clear structure in terms of how you lose a job at work. So, you know, first you get verbal, you know, something verbally, then you get something written down, and then maybe you go on probation. And so if it's not just, okay, you make a mistake, you're fired, that gives people a little bit more freedom, a little bit more psychological safety in their jobs. They feel more that they can take risks without being embarrassed or without, you know, being severely punished. And another is to encourage or celebrate mistakes. And what I mean by that isn't to say, okay, everybody should mess up, right? But if somebody does mess up in trying to do something big, trying to be innovative, to not necessarily punish or embarrass that person, but to say, look, you made a mistake along the way. I don't expect you to do it again, but you know, don't make the same mistake twice, but you're certainly not going to be punished for trying to do something new. And that's something that a lot of organizations don't have. And I can tell you, I've been in companies that have that sense of safety and others that don't. And the ones that have it, the people tend to be so much more engaged and motivated. So number 2 is dependability. So this overlaps with that characteristics of high performance teams of mutual accountability. So people who are dependable, they get things done on time. They do what they say they're going to do. So you've got to sort of establish this early on and make sure that people know, hey, there are going to be consequences if you don't do your job. And this is what those consequences are going to be. So as we'll find out, you know, later, setting those team norms. Next is structure and clarity. So team members have clear roles. We talked before about role ambiguity. With role ambiguity, we're unsure of what our roles are, and that becomes really problematic because we're not sure, you know, who on the team is doing what's due, you know, how we're going to go about getting that done. And so effective teams tend to have a lot of clarity and structure. Number 4 is meaning. So that overlaps with shared purpose. People should find that work is personally meaningful and relevant to them. And in terms of your teams, that might be something as simple as having people do work that they're really interested in. You know, break up the work based on what people want to do rather than what they have to do. And then impact. So team members feel that the work that they're doing matters. And as a leader, this might just be saying, hey, great job. I really appreciate what you did, or, you know, that work was really interesting, whatever it is. You just want to make them feel that, you know, be honest about it, but you want to make them feel that their work matters, that their contribution matters. Okay. So let's move on to what teams, you know, we know that these are general attributes that make effective teams at Google, and they overlap with those 5 disciplines. The only one you don't see here is team size, but we know that Google tends to stick with a small team size anyway. So in terms of the norms that are effective at Google, we can find this out through Project Aristotle. They named it that because Aristotle said the sum is greater than the parts. And so they wanted to see if that was true. You know, are teams better than any individual? And so they found that there were two teams that made there were two norms that made really effective teams. And those are communication and empathy. So does anyone here feel like they, you know, not necessarily on the team that you're on right now, but that maybe you don't speak very often, or maybe you speak too much in your team? Generally, the extroverts tend to speak more on a team than introverts. And in fact, two people on a team, on a 4-person team, generally do 70% of the speaking. So it's super important if you are that extroverted person to try to pull out those ideas and the conversations from those people who are more introverted. So communication is really important in terms of people speaking in roughly equal proportions on the team. And so I know I tend to be one of those more extroverted people, and I have to tell myself, hey, you know, ask the other people who are talking questions, try to get their ideas, because oftentimes they're going to have really good ideas. They just haven't had a chance to voice. And then empathy. So when we talk about empathy, there's a couple different aspects to this. Matthew Ricard, who's known as one of the happiest people in the world. He's a Buddhist monk, and he was I think a physicist at Harvard by training. He said empathy is a faculty to resonate with the feelings of others. When we meet someone who's joyful, we smile. When we witness someone in pain, we suffer in resonance with his or her suffering. So empathy has a cognitive and an emotional aspect. So cognitively, we're able to take the perspective of other people. We're able to put ourselves in their shoes and get an idea of, you know, what that person's thinking. And then the emotional aspect is we're able to feel what they're feeling. We're able to put ourselves not just in their shoes cognitively, but to say, this is what it must be like to be that person. So in terms of empathy, you know, if a team member is high in empathy, they're probably going to be really good at listening, on understanding emotions, expressions of other people. So what I want you to do now is I'm going to give you a little exercise in empathy, and I'm going to leave this up here while you do it. So these exercises have been shown to increase your awareness of how empathetic you are and to increase your empathy. So what I want you to do is just do one or two of these on the list. Definitely do number one. So first, you're going to think of someone in your life. This can be someone at work or home with whom you've had a difficult relationship. This may be someone that you've had little compassion or empathy for. Now I want you to imagine and write down what that person may have gone through to make them so unpleasant, to hinder your relationship so much. Try to think about what it would be like to be in their shoes. Imagine, if you will, feeling like that person all of the time. So I want you to do that one, and then I'm going to give you about 5 minutes to do this. And then if you have time, try to tackle number 2 and 3. So, you know, I think sometimes we tend to see or look for the worst in other people. And this is something called the self-serving bias, that we tend to, when we make mistakes, we tend to blame that on the situation rather than ourselves. You know, I made a mistake because of this or that. Whereas when other people make mistakes, we tend to blame that on personal characteristics, like that person's lazy, or you know, whatever it is. And so the problem with that, obviously, is that we give ourselves more favorable treatment than others, and by thinking the worst about people, it makes it really hard to have a good bond, have a good relationship with them. So, you know, next time you're having a hard time with someone, it can be really useful to realize that maybe there's a reason for, you know, maybe they didn't do their assignment because their parents were up fighting all night, or, you know, they're working 2 jobs to try to take care of their family members, or, you know, not that this is an excuse for poor performance, but it certainly helps you to deal with them a little bit more compassionately. Okay. So let's move on to the stages of team development. And this is something that, so this is the stages of generally successful teams. This is something we've found that most teams that tend to do well go through five stages. And you, when I say you may go through this, you may not. Teams that are as short term as the teams that you're on, sometimes what they do is something called punctuated equilibrium, where they tend to get together. They skip most of the steps in here. They don't do anything until the very end. And then just before the project's due, they come together and finish the project. And usually it's not a very strong result. So you've probably pulled an all-nighter or done something like that where you've had to work with the team members at the last minute possible. And this is essentially what we call with punctuated equilibrium, that you don't go through the formal stages of team development. So if for longer term teams that are successful, they generally start with forming. So this is a period of getting to know each other, getting acquainted. There's a lot of anxiety here because people don't know their roles, they don't know each other, but there's some excitement too of getting to know new people. And then after that, we tend to see storming. So this is when people start to engage in conflict. So you get to know each other's personalities more disagreements emerge. And oftentimes the leader of the team needs to sort of step up and address these things before they get out of hand. And some teams don't move past the storming stage. You'll find that some teams argue the entire time, and they don't move on to the next steps which are needed to be successful. So after storming, we have norming. So consensus develops around leadership and people's roles. So team norms are established, codes of conduct that are either implicit or explicit. So again, implicit is not written down. This could be something like maybe somebody shows up late for a meeting and the other people get upset with them or give them, sort of a dirty look the next time they see them. You're enforcing this unwritten rule. But what's more beneficial is to have explicit norms and to say at this point, okay, this is what we expect, and these are the consequences if you don't abide by these rules. So the norming stage is useful because once you get these norms out of the way, people know, okay, this is how we're supposed to deal with each other. This is how we're supposed to communicate with each other. This is when we get things done. We're each accountable for certain things, and the group tends to start working more cohesively, which brings us to performing. So in the performing stage, the team is more mature. It's organized, it's well functioning. So in terms of the performing stage, you'll see that most of the work is, in terms of team effectiveness, you're about as effective at this point as you're going to be. You've already formed, your roles, you've gotten disagreements and conflict out of the way, you've developed team norms, and now you're doing well. And then that brings us to adjourning. So at this stage, the leader essentially wants to celebrate accomplishments of the team members, because remember, if you want a team to be, if we're defining a successful team in part as members being satisfied and wanting to work together in the future, it's really important for the leader at this point to make sure that they do celebrate the wins that team had, to potentially usually there's a formal event to celebrate this, and it could be a get-together, socializing, whatever it is, and then you disband. So that generally is, if we look at the research on all the effective teams, they generally follow those 5 stages, and they're not always. It's not always that you'll go from one to the other. You might go from norming back to storming, or you might go from performing back to storming. It really depends on your individual team. And again, this holds true more for longer term teams. Teams that are just together for a very short assignment, like the one you're doing, you might not necessarily go through all of these. But if you want to be successful and you're looking at this and saying, okay, we're arguing a lot right now, you can probably guess that you're in that storming stage, and you need to develop those effective team norms to be able to move forward and to perform well. Okay. So in terms of threats to team performance, there are a couple of things here that we want to understand if we want our teams to perform well. At this point, we know sort of what a team is, what a high performing team is. These individuals who are consistently high performing, who have complementary skill sets, and they're doing work that requires interdependence. We know generally, the attributes of a successful team, that they tend to have things like mutual accountability. We know the norms that generally work well based on the research at Google, that they tend to communicate well, they tend to be empathetic. But there are some other things that we want to be aware of as we move forward in our teams, and that is what these threats are and how to minimize them. So in terms of the threats, I'll start with cognitive biases, which are essentially deviations from rational thought. So when we look at cognitive biases, we've got two to consider. So one is narrow perspectives. This is just going back to what we talked about with that curse of knowledge. This is a lot of overlap with that. So you tend to overestimate what other people know, and assume that they see the world the way that you do. And that's going to be something you probably already realized that that's not the case. But when you approach a problem, something might be really clear to you, really straightforward in terms of this is what's wrong and this is how we should solve it. But other people might have different perspectives that are also valid. And so you want to, try to step back occasionally and say, okay, does this person have, a good point? Should we think through the way that they're trying to solve this problem? And is there something that I can learn from that? Or do I need to change my perspective in some way? Sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't. And then next is uneven communication. So I mentioned before, 2 people in a group of 4 tend to do 70% of the talking. And we know that effective teams tend to have more even distribution of communication among group members. So it's, again, really important if you're introverted to get out of your comfort zone and try to speak up. And if you're extroverted, to realize that you probably are talking too much and that you need to reel it back and try to draw out ideas from those people who aren't speaking quite as much. So those are the cognitive biases that we need to be aware of. Next is social loafing. If you've ever worked in a team, I'm certain that this happened to you. So when we're talking about social loafing, some people, when they get onto a team, they tend not to work as hard on the team as they would individually. So what do you think the reason for that is? It doesn't mean that they're bad people. Some people tend not to work as hard in groups, and sometimes it's context specific. Sometimes maybe they feel that their skill set isn't being acknowledged, and so they kind of take a back seat. But we find generally there's 2 main reasons why people socially loaf on teams. And the first is a lack of accountability, that it's not clear who's responsible for what. So when you went through that forming stage, there's still role ambiguity, that it wasn't clear who on the team is responsible for what assignments when, or maybe consequences haven't been set up if they don't do their job. And so people, when they don't have any accountability, they might not do their job. Maybe they're not highly conscientious, and so they might not do what they have to do or what they're supposed to do. And another is sucker aversion. And so maybe you've been burned in the past and you've done all the work on a team and you want to make sure that this isn't you again. And so you kind of say, okay, I'm not going to be the one to step up because I don't want to be taken advantage of. And so, when you see people socially loafing, this isn't, it's not because they're a bad person necessarily. It's a lot of different reasons, but the main ones are that either you haven't set up an accountability system, and it could also be that they don't want to be the suckers on the team. So in terms of what to do, this is pretty easy to solve, at least the first one. So this lack of accountability, we can set up identifiability, which means that we put a spotlight on each person's contribution, which you should be doing anyway, because you want to acknowledge the work that people are doing. But when people aren't doing their work, it should be visible to everyone in the team. And so this could be something like a shared Google Drive, like a Google like Excel doc, where you've got different responsibilities listed with due dates and the person who's responsible for it next to that. And you can see who's done what when. And if somebody hasn't done it, you can see that they haven't done it, and it's visible to everyone in the group. And so that helps to shine a spotlight on each person's contribution, but it's not necessarily enough. right? Because some people might just not do it and say, I don't really care. So you need to have predetermined consequences if people don't go through with what they're supposed to do. So those team contracts that you signed, it needs to be clear that this is going to affect this person in a meaningful way if they don't do what they're supposed to do. So at work, that could be through, incentives. Maybe they lose out on certain bonuses. On your team, it could be through points in class. But if you don't have those two things, it's going to be really hard to deal with social loathing. So another is, so oftentimes when we get people in groups, they tend to conform. And so essentially they give into the pressure or the perceived wishes of the group. So what happens, and this is a specific type of social conformity, is called groupthink. And this is where the desire for harmony leads to irrational or dysfunctional decision making. So essentially what people do is they say, well, I don't want to rock the boat here. I'm just going to kind of let things go as they may. I'm going to be really agreeable. And so I'm just not going to get involved. So some people might self-censor their thoughts and ideas. So I'm just not going to say what I'm thinking. And they might be unwilling to criticize others. And this can lead to pretty disastrous outcomes. So if we look at like the Stanford prison experiment, so what happened, and imagine you're in this position where Fresno State offers you a little bit of money to do to be in an experiment, a psychological experiment. You might say, cool, a few extra bucks, I might do it. But then imagine you flip a coin and you're either a prison guard or you're a prisoner. Let's say in this case, you're a prisoner. Now, police with real uniforms, real cars show up to your house unannounced. You get a knock on the door and the police officer takes out handcuffs and arrests you, puts you in the cop car and takes you to what looks like a very real prison. Now, you still think that, okay, this is an experiment, but you're not totally sure. I mean, this is really realistic. Now, let's look at the prison guards. So you're essentially given, as much power as you want over these people. And there's not much that's going to stop you. You've got Philip Zimbardo, who is the professor who is running the prison experiment. But I mean, these guards were given, pretty much absolute power. So what happened was that the guards essentially took their roles a little too seriously. They got a little too much into it, and they started psychologically torturing the prisoners. And so they would do things like strip them naked. They wouldn't let them use the bathroom. They would put them in very awkward positions. And this happened within a matter of days. And so the people who would have spoken out, they tended to give in to groupthink. They said, well, I knew that something bad was happening, but I didn't want to say anything. And so they either just kind of turned their backs, or some of them left the experiment. And they just quit the experiment, but didn't stop anybody. They're afraid to criticize other people because they didn't want to ruin the harmony or the cohesiveness of the group. They didn't want to kind of ruin the fun. And so this was, a bad situation. And what ended up happening actually was a student went to Philip Zimbardo and said, hey, this is insane. This is crazy. You've got to stop this experiment. He ended up later marrying the student, but he listened to her and he cut off the experiment. But the students had, psychological issues from this for quite some time. And Philip Zimbardo is also the one who looked at the Abu Ghraib prisons and other prisons the U.S. has had where we've tortured people, and he found very similar things happening. Essentially, guards given absolute power, giving into groupthink, doing what they believe are the desires of the rest of the group, and leading to really kind of terrible behavior that they wouldn't do individually. So we want to try to avoid groupthink, obviously, because this desire for harmony is overcoming our ability to think rationally and to engage in effective decision making. So there are a couple of things we can do. One is we want to kind of play devil's advocate here and think, is what we're doing the right thing? We want to encourage objections and critical thinking. So if instead of people feeling like they can't they can't say anything because they might be, thought of negatively by the group, or they might hurt the cohesiveness of the group. You want to ask people, are we moving in the right direction? Are we making the right decisions? Tell me how we can be wrong. That's one thing I liked about Elon Musk and Tesla. He said, whenever he's trying to think of an idea, he always asks people and asks himself, well, what if I'm wrong? What in that case? What's going to happen? Tell me a way that I could be wrong. So thinking about it from a different perspective, asking neutral parties to weigh in. So who are people that don't play a role here? Maybe they can look at it with less bias. Then seek out the biases that you have in your group. Do people tend to do things a certain way? Do people tend to have biases against people because of their race or their gender, or other personal characteristics that you need to identify and be aware of, and for them to be aware of as well. So these are just some of the ways that you can address groupthink. But I think the biggest one here is just to really have a culture of encouraging objections, having people, and this goes back to that idea of psychological safety. People should feel that they can make objections, they can even make mistakes without being severely penalized for it. So you should encourage these types of viewpoints to ensure that you're doing the right thing. So, okay, so what we're going to go over next is sort of a how-to guide for you, just to kind of come back to if you're having an issue with your team. But this stuff's pretty straightforward. So let's say you're having a trouble on your team and you want to resolve it. You can do a couple things to either avoid the issue altogether, to avoid having the issue arise altogether, or in order to address an issue. So first, you want to hold effective meetings. So if you're getting together as a team, you should also always have an agenda that you send out beforehand, so that you're going from one point to another and time's not being wasted. You need to determine what's most important on that agenda, so you're sure that you do get it done. So if things are going slowly on other items, you say that you're going to go back to it later, or try to resolve it more quickly. Providing specific action items to each members. Your team members should be walking, especially for you if you're a leader on the team, people should walk away from the meeting knowing exactly what's expected of them, when they're going to do it, and to some degree how they're going to do it if they need help with that. One important thing is I mentioned to you before the commander's intent, that in the military, at the end of, in certain branches of the military, at the end of the meeting, they have the commander's intent, which is the most important aspect of that meeting to walk away with. People aren't going to remember everything you say, so you should be able to summarize the main points of your meeting at the very end, and people should walk away knowing what's expected. And then keep your meetings short. They shouldn't be, I think one thing that this whole pandemic has taught a lot of people is that there are a lot of meetings that aren't necessary, that we waste a lot of time in meetings. So if you're going to have a meeting, you should really realize that your time is important, your team members' time is important, and you don't want to take any more than you need to. So in terms of understanding member profiles, this just refers to get to know each other's personalities and preferences. The tough thing with this virtual team is you're not really getting to do that too much. I mean, if you're holding Zoom calls, you should be getting some idea of, how each other prefer to work and communicate. But it's much easier to do with face-to-face teams, where you can have social get-togethers and have some time outside of work where you spend with each other. So it's certainly harder for what you're doing. Build team cohesion. So again, this refers back to, it's hard to get to know each other if you're not able to see each other. But you should have some time where, you've got some time to socialize. And so maybe you schedule, or maybe you have sort of an implicit norm where people get on the Zoom call a few minutes early before the meeting starts to catch up and talk to each other. You can also make sure that as a leader, you're highlighting people's contributions. So if someone's worked really hard on something, you want to call that out during a meeting, and really try to get agreement on what needs to get done and how you're going to do that, so that you can all be working toward the same goal. And the next aspect is after action reviews. So this is super important, and it's something it's overlooked way too often. But in an after action review, this is a structured review or a debrief of a process for analyzing what happened, why it happened, and how it can be done better. Essentially, the short of it is, after you do something, you want to say, okay, what did we do? What worked? What didn't work? And what can we do better in the future? One of the best things about this is you can create best practices for the future. So, one company I worked at, we would go do nuclear outage maintenance. So, nuclear power plant would shut down. We'd send our engineers and technicians in to do the work, and our project managers, and we'd either get it done on time early, or we wouldn't. And so, at the end of every project, we'd get together and say, okay, how did this go? What could we do differently in the future? What are best practices that we need to institutionalize? And we learned a lot about, how to work more efficiently and more optimally. So number 5 has to deal with social loafing. Deal with the free riders, the people who aren't doing work. You need to, as I mentioned with the identifiability, you need to put the spotlight on that work that they're doing. You need to call out in a way that is effective. You need to call out that person for the work that they're not being done. So you shouldn't be afraid to say, hey, I noticed in our shared Google Doc that you haven't done this, and you said you were going to do it by this day. So what's going on? Do you have everything you need? Is there, do you need help on this? And ask that person, for a reason for why they're not getting their work done. And you've hopefully already got predetermined penalties set up, and so you need to follow through consistently with those penalties. In terms of virtual teams, and this is the last thing that we're going to cover today, there's a video in here for you to watch whenever you have a chance, just a few tips on how to optimize your virtual teams. But the virtual teams that you're working on, this is something I think that, we're all going to be faced with, at least for the next 6 months to a year, maybe longer, for our jobs. There are a lot of companies. I know Spotify, they just had this huge office in New York City built, and they said that they're never going to go back to it, that their employees are able to work better at home. So we're going to have a lot of, I think, companies transitioning to more virtual work. So when we think about virtual teams, this is different in that, of course, these are people who are working generally from different locations, using technology to collaborate, and there's a lot that gets in the way. When we're dealing with things like email or chat, there's, intonation is lost, sarcasm is often lost. It's hard to communicate as effectively. In fact, at a study recently at Elon University, they asked students if they communicated better in face-to-face or through electronic communication, and they said, although they communicate better face-to-face, they tend to prefer electronic communication, or they tend to use that more often. So people have a preference for something that's less effective. And that's going to be tough to deal with, because we need to be able to communicate as well virtually as we do face-to-face. And there's a lot of challenges there, right? We have a lot of distance between us when we're on a virtual team. And so some of that distance is obvious. We've got geographic distance. We've got temporal. People might be in different time zones. You might have cultural differences or distance. And also linguistics. There might be language barriers. You might be here and you're trying to work with someone who's, in Europe or in Mexico. So we need to try to manage all these different dynamics. And that can be really hard, partly because we tend to have, when we have more differences, we tend to have less of a shared identity. So these different effects of distance, they impact us through shared identity and shared context. And shared identity is the extent to which we understand our similarities with us, between us and our team members. So has anyone kind of, felt that you're very different, or maybe gotten along with someone in your team really well because you had a lot in common, or a coworker? Well, we know that, generally, we all have these barriers that we set up around us, right? We tend to like people who, there's this concept of homophily, and we tend to like to spend time around people who are similar to ourselves. Now, when I say similar to ourselves, I don't mean race and gender, although we do see patterns there. I mean, people who, if you like video games or volleyball or hiking or reading or whatever it is, and you find someone who has that same interest, then you automatically have something in common and you have more of a shared identity. You understand your similarity to that person and you connect with that. So in terms of this shared identity, when we don't have that, this was a term before COVID, obviously, but we have what's called social distance, or an unshared sense of identity. This is when we see this us versus them mentality. This was really, when we look at evolution, this was really important in terms of, when you're living in a tribe and you've got somebody new who you don't know coming into your tribe, well, chances are that's not going to be beneficial to you. That person might want to harm you. They might want to take what you have. So we became very good at creating these small tribes and setting up barriers between us and other people, that we saw other people as potentially dangerous. And we see this still today, that we tend to have in-groups and out-groups. And your in-group tends to be your close family and friends, and your out-group tends to be everyone else. And so we see ourselves as very different from everyone else and very similar to our in-group. And the more that we have those differences, the harder it is to work together, because, we just see ourselves as being so dissimilar that it's hard to approach problems collectively. It's hard to come together. So one of the best ways you can do that is, at our core, we're all really similar, right? We all want to be appreciated. We all want to be loved. We all want to feel safe. We don't want to have to worry about money. We want to do things that we enjoy. We want to be passionate about something, a purpose. We have so many things in common. And there's one thing I liked, that there was a guy who he's African-American, and he has, for the last, I think 10 or 20 years, been out working with KKK members to convert them. And he's gotten like over 100 of KKK members to turn over their robes. And when somebody asked him about this, how can you as a Black man work with these KKK members, and how can you, why would you do it? How can you do it? He said, at the end of the day, even your biggest enemy, you probably have a lot more in common with them than you do differences. And he said, as soon as I can get them to see me as a human being, as soon as I can get them to see me as worthy of, of love and affection and all these other things, those similarities, those commonalities tend to come out. And I thought that was so amazing. I mean, this is a guy who is, hated by this group for the color of his skin. And he's able to not just deal with them, not just accept them for who they are, but he's able to empathize with them and work with them. And for some of them, he's able to convert them, to give up this ideology that they had. I thought that was incredible. So this shared identity, it might sound silly, but this is a huge impact. This has a huge impact on your team performance. You need to find what the similarities are that you have with one another, so you can draw those out. And it doesn't mean that you have to have focus only on your similarities. You probably have differences like expertise, experiences that you can draw in, and you can celebrate those differences. And those can be beneficial to your team and to getting things done. For example, if one person on your team has a similarity with one of your customers, the rest of the team tends to understand that customer better. So differences can be beneficial as well. But if we want the shared identity, we've got to find a way to connect, to understand our similarities. Okay, so the other way that those aspects of distance, like geographic, like linguistic, cultural, the other ways that those impact us is through shared context. So this is a shared understanding of not only what you do, but how you do it and why. And so this would be something like you doing something and someone doesn't understand why you did it, and they assume that you did it wrong, or they assume that your intentions were bad or something like that. So the more that we can say, okay, this is the way that you do things, this is why you do them, and this is, the more we can say, okay, this makes sense, or it doesn't make sense, and work through different ways to get that done. But we just want to generally understand where we're each coming from, because otherwise things can get misconstrued. You might think that one of your team members is doing something for the wrong reasons, when in fact they have a very valid reason for doing it that way. So we want to communicate about these things. And lastly, managing the effects of distance we can kind of overcome these issues of shared identity and context through focusing on a shared purpose. So that's that super inordinate goal. What is it about your organization that's important? For some companies, it's going to be really easy, like St. Jude, where I did my PhD in Memphis, and we had this cancer research hospital there, and a lot of my friends worked at it. And their shared purpose was pretty understandable. Everybody knew that they were there to improve the lives of these children who were going through a pretty traumatic event in their lives. So that's something that brought them all together, that overcame even, the most basic differences that they had. They were all working toward this one thing. But for you and your company, if you're a big corporation, you might not know what their shared purpose is. So you need to figure out, in what way is your organization, why should people buy into what you're doing? In what way are you serving the greater good, or are you benefiting society, or in what are you doing that's going to make people want to work for you and engage with you? And if you're not doing those things, then it might be time to sort of evaluate, hey, what can we be doing differently? But my guess is most of you work for companies that are doing at least something good. When I worked at a nuclear power plant, when you asked people, what are you doing that's beneficial? What's the shared purpose that we all have? Most of them didn't know because they'd never really thought about it. But at the end of the day, we were helping deliver cleaner energy to people at fairly low prices. And, it was a little bit of a stretch there, but we were doing some good things for people. And it's important to identify what those are. So another is to encourage information sharing. So we want to try to set up channels for people to be able to openly communicate with one another without much of a hindrance. So one of the ways to do this is not have a huge hierarchy in your organization, that if you want something done, you've got to go through your boss, who goes through her boss, and so forth. You should be able to freely go out throughout the organization to question people who you need to help you solve a problem. And then continually assess kind of where you're at. Are we working in the right direction? Is there something we need to be doing differently? Are we doing the right things? And a big part of this is saying, okay, here's where we are, here's where we want to be, and here's how we're going to get here. So knowing what those outcome goals are, knowing what your super inordinate goal is, or your greater purpose, and then knowing what your activity goals are to get there, and how well you're progressing on those things along the way. And when you're in an organization, part of this becomes embedded or institutionalized in your other processes. Like for your HR process, you might have a management by objectives performance appraisal that tracks these things over time. But as a leader in your group, you want to be aware of those things and where you're at. And the last thing is just being grateful. There's another video on here at the end about gratitude. I'm not going to have you watch it here, but you can watch it after if you want. And it's so easy to get caught up in conflict in teams, and to get caught up in how we're different rather than alike. But if we take some time to try to look at people in the best light, to try to be grateful for the work that they're doing, and for your opportunity to get to know someone new and to work with them. I know not everybody's easy to be grateful for, and some people are going to be more difficult than others. But at the end of the day, you're both spending your time on your important time on each other and on this project. And just to recognize that and try to be grateful for one another can be useful as well. Okay. Well, that is all I have for you today.